Dr. Susan Corey is a professor of special and general education at Touro University in New York City. She works with faculty to improve and revise courses to include the most up-to-date evidence-based practices in early childhood education. Corey is also a professor emerita at San Francisco State University and continues to work with colleagues and doctoral students in the Bay Area. She is the primary investigator of a 5-year U.S. Department of Education Innovation and Research Early Phase Grant, Young Academic Music and Computational Thinking. Dr. Gilbert Franco is a licensed marriage and family therapist and an assistant professor of psychology at Beacon College in Leesburg, Florida, America's first accredited baccalaureate institution dedicated to educating students with learning and attention issues. Before Beacon, he served as the lead faculty area chair for psychology for the University of Phoenix, San Diego, California. Franco also served as clinical director for the McAllister Institute in El Cajon, where he supervised interns studying marriage and family therapy and clinical social work. Dr. Angela Nelson is the Executive Director of Clinical Services for Rethink Care, a platform that provides working parents behavioral health support for themselves and their children, including those with developmental disabilities. Nelson oversees a team of clinicians providing one-to-one parent training to families worldwide. She leverages both her experience as a board-certified behavior analyst and a counselor with marriage and family specialization to support the needs of families raising children with various learning and behavioral challenges. Nelson also co-hosts the podcast Behaviorally Speaking, which focuses on common scenarios most parents face and provides them tangible, lighthearted tips and techniques. And we're starting our conversation with Dr. Corey. How can a stranger's words or actions unknowingly impact a parent or a child with learning and attention issues?
Words are really important, and they convey different types of meanings. And it's very important that our children with any type of learning or attention issues think positively about themselves. Strangers sometimes unknowingly will say things like, well, I've heard phrases, he ain't right, or he just needs more discipline. When in truth is, we really need to look at disability through the lens of ability, because any individual with any type of learning or attention issue has far more abilities than they have disabilities. And one thing that we can do to really help our children not be affected by negative language is to not use it at home and to always be very supportive of our children's ability and also help them to continually believe in themselves and be advocates for themselves and their abilities.
Thank you, Dr. Corey. So, Dr. Franco, shame and guilt are often common emotions that parents who are raising neurodivergent children feel. How can these kinds of insensitive comments exacerbate these feelings?
Great question, Daryl. So, when it comes to these kinds of comments, it's really important to think about self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is a person's belief in their ability to do something. And parents, every parent, experiences some doubt. And comments such as this can impact their sense of, self-efficacy and their ability to even take care of their child. When you have people telling them this or that and putting a parent down, it erodes their self-efficacy. And in turn, a child is watching and the child is learning from their parents through something called social learning. So damaging a parent's self-efficacy in turn impacts the child's self-efficacy themselves. So it really is a downward spiral. So we really have to watch what we say around parents with children with learning differences.
So, Dr. Nelson, many parents who are raising children who learn differently often feel isolated, like there's nobody else who is going through these struggles that they are. How can a stranger's comments intensify this sense of isolation?
Yeah,
Yeah, some people don't fully appreciate or kind of understand what it takes to raise a neurodivergent child and all the logistics that goes into that. And so sometimes even their best attempts at being helpful, like, for example, saying things like, oh, it will get better, or you just need to do X, Y, and Z, it could feel very minimizing for those families. It can also really erode their confidence and feels like an even bigger divide because others may not understand. Some people don't have much experience interacting with people with disabilities, and so they might have some biases or misconceptions. And so they might actually avoid parents and their children because of the unknown, and that can make isolation even worse.
So, Dr. Corey, I'm wondering, family and strangers, they're not trained professionals, but sometimes I'm wondering whether teachers who are trained professionals fall into this trap of using insensitive language when they're dealing with parents of neurodivergent children.
Yes, and it's hard to rethink when you're not always around neurodivergent children. But a couple simple things that we can do when we communicate with teachers and other parents is to remember that the child is first. So we use child first language, meaning, for example, my son has Tourette's syndrome. So he's not a Tourette's syndrome son, he is a child with Tourette's. So we always want to use child first language. And also keep up on proper terms. For example, we don't use the term mental retardation anymore. We use learning differences or cognitive differences. We always want to be very positive because the positive language that we can help, we can model it for our colleagues, we can model it for other parents, and always remember that the best thing to call a child is by their first name. And also, the child is not their learning difference. The child is someone with all kinds of interests and gifts and abilities. And I think if we continually press that point, spread the word, it will spread. And maybe we could even get disability out of our lexicon and use the term difference, positive differences.
All right. So, Dr. Franco, a lot of times parents are caught flat-footed by comments such as they'll grow out of it or they're not trying hard enough. I'm wondering, is there some way that you can coach parents to better respond to these types of comments, number one, so that they're not ruining a relationship, but also using it as a teaching moment?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. So speaking not just as a therapist, but also as a parent with someone with learning differences, I've been at the other end of that, conversation where I've had, a teacher tell me, oh, if they just try harder, they'll grow out of it, or, they're just not trying hard enough. And it's important for, us parents to understand that the educator may not know what it's like to have someone with a learning difference. So as a therapist, I would work with, my parents in understanding that, oftentimes it's due to lack of education or due to lack of experience. So it's important to first and foremost, remain calm and, and to really try to understand where the educator is coming from, and then, convey your message in a clear, concise manner so that they understand where you're coming from. So again, when we get into like arguments with teachers and educators, that's when, the help doesn't occur. So it's important to really, coach parents to remain calm, to know their child, to know their diagnosis, to know how to convey this information to the educator in a way that the educator will not feel threatened by it.
So, Dr. Nelson, it's kind of a common thing when parents get together for them to go, when my kid was this age, he was doing this. Or when my Sally was doing this, she was building puzzles with Lego and whatnot. So, it's kind of a common thing for parents to want to compare their children. But I'm wondering how that impacts parents who are raising children who learn differently when someone whose child is neurotypical is being compared to their child.
Yeah, absolutely. Some parents are really proud when their child is maybe early to meeting certain milestones or achievements, but comparing their child to another child, especially if that child is maybe not meeting their milestones at the same rate, really isn't that helpful. It might be well-meaning, and maybe there's an intent to give some advice. And I will say, during the pandemic, this was an interesting time because a lot of families didn't have a point of reference. Their child wasn't going to preschool or daycare. And so they maybe didn't see other children and their development. So in some cases, those conversations may have been helpful. But I think, generally, we see this a lot with well-meaning family members in particular when we bring those topics up. I've found that in talking with parents, a really good response to these conversations is saying something simple like, "Oh, thank you. We're going to head over to the doctor soon for a well-child visit, and we'll talk about it with our doctor."
Okay. So, Dr. Corey, sometimes strangers, as we've been talking about, will offer unsolicited advice. Can you suggest some ways and polite ways that parents can help to shut down these comments so they don't have to deal with them and feel like they're inferior as parents?
Sure. One of my favorite phrases is, "Oh, that's something to think about." And of course, you don't have to think about it, but it just acknowledges what they said. I don't need to be rude. I don't necessarily have to be discourteous to them, but it kind of ends the conversation. Then I might switch the conversation to, "Oh, well, let me just tell you about my son. He won a swim meet yesterday." So bring up the positive aspects and sort of turn the conversation around. Another thing that we could always do, and I've mentioned this a little bit before, is our children can be their own best advocate. And so making them feel comfortable and sharing their differences is also helpful because our children have a lot more to be proud about. And so, one aspect of their learning does not define them. And so, once again, this is just something to think about.
Okay. So, Dr. Frankel, you mentioned that you're a parent of a child who learns differently. And I imagine as children get older and people are making these comments, they start to comprehend what they're saying about them. How do you as a parent respond to the child who's hearing these kind of comments that make them appear to be odd or just otherworldly?
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that happens. It happens more often than we would like it to be. And, it usually comes from a place of people trying to understand something that they don't know. So when, you have a child asking you that, it can be very impactful for the parent, right? Because, again, the parent is trying to deal with it. And then you have a child who, is, barely developing themselves, and they don't have the experience, the life experience to deal with these kinds of issues. So it's important to, for the parent to explain, what other people mean by these kinds of questions in a way that they can, understand. But as you're explaining them, it's always important to also make it a point to tell the child that it's not their fault, that, that they're not lesser than anyone else, that even though that they may be different in some ways, that doesn't mean that they're a lesser person. That just means that they have, specific abilities. For example, my child, he, has problems with language. And, some people have made, these issues known. But, he's really strong in mathematics. He's like a grade or two above his grade level in mathematics, and he loves building houses. So whenever he asks me, oh, why do people make fun of me because of X, Y, or Z? I talk to him about, that some people may not understand, how he communicates, just like how some people may not understand how I communicate or how his mom communicates. And then after talking about that, then I would shift the focus to his strengths and talk about, oh, but you know what? You're really great at building houses, in your Minecraft game. You want to be an architect, you're really good at math. These are things that they're really great about you. That way he leaves, the conversation with something positive about himself.
All right. So, Dr. Nelson, let's shift gears for a moment and focus on the positive. So, let's say you have family members, particularly, it seems to be a lot of times with older family members who aren't familiar with the terminology that we're using today. How can you help them to make more positive inroads in having conversations about what's going on with a particular child, so they can ask questions that they can learn from and that they can also support the child?
Yeah, absolutely. I have the pleasure of working with parents raising neurodivergent children every day. And what I've started to see is there are definitely some common themes in terms of comments that seem to really empower and uplift these families. They tend to be more strength-based approaches. We oftentimes hear things like, wow, how are you able to keep your cool while, this tantrum was happening? Or, I just wanted to let you know that it looks like you're doing a great job. So really empowering them and pointing out the things that they're doing well and their strengths can be really, really helpful. Another thing too, in terms of what strangers and even loved ones can do beyond what they can say, is allowing their kids or encouraging their kids to play with neurodivergent children, maybe at the park, for example. So, I've talked with a lot of families who really encourage question asking, as opposed to maybe some whispering or avoidance, right? So encouraging children to come up and ask questions about their child or why their child might be behaving differently than the rest of the kids at the playground. So having kids engage and show interest in that, as opposed to maybe avoiding or kind of staying off aside.
Okay. So Dr. Corey, Dr. Nelson just mentioned children playing together, and that raises a question about play dates and things like that. And if you've got neurodivergent kids who are interacting with neurotypical kids, there may be some situations where some awkward interactions occur. Maybe the child is autistic and is stimming, and people are wondering what's that all about. Can you offer us some tips for helping parents who are raising children who learn differently navigate these types of interactions?
Sure. It's interesting because sometimes when we see a child doing a particular thing, we tend to provide a motive. We give the motive for the behavior, and we have no idea why the behavior is occurring. And so I always remind family members, parents, that a behavior is not necessarily an intention, or I know that my children and other children don't stay up all night thinking of behaviors to annoy other people. Behaviors often are a form of communication. You mentioned stemming. That is a soothing technique. And so to help other parents understand some of the behaviors that occur that are related to learning differences is really helpful. And it's also helpful to help other parents understand the importance of routines and behavior management techniques. Simple things like some things can be ignored. Some things can be reframed so that it is not necessarily something bad, but we turn the situation around and we make it a positive thing. So behavior is a form of communication. And if we can reinforce that and find different ways and model and teach our children to understand their behaviors and to understand different forms of behaviors to address a communication need, is very helpful for the child and the parent, because a child wants other people's approbations, approval, other children's approval. And so we want to help them get it. And so we want to praise good behavior, and we want to be sure that we're always positive, that and positive thinking about the display of different behaviors.
All right. Dr. Franco, sometimes well-meaning family members or acquaintances might question a neurodivergent child's diagnosis or their education plan. How can parents constructively address these concerns?
Thank you, Daryl. And yes, it happens quite a bit. I mean, if you're a parent, especially a parent of young children, you're going to get relatives and other well-meaning people to, put their shoe in, their ideas in. And as a parent, it's important to first, educate yourself, so you come from a place of knowing as to your child's situation. And then, and this is hard to do, by the way, it's hard to do for me as a parent because there's a bunch of relatives that, like to have their opinion. But this is important, is as a parent, to really sit down and reflectively listen to what the relative is saying. And by what I mean by reflection is, listen and then, mirror back what the relative said. Like, for example, if the relative said, oh, they should try harder, and then that parent would sit there and listen and say, oh, okay, so what you're telling me is, that we should try harder with our child. And then, once you reflectively listen, then you would, follow up with what you know about your child's diagnosis and what you research. So you would say, okay, thank you for, sharing your opinion. And, this is what I've learned, from my doctors and from my own research, and then talk about, your child in a non-judgmental way. And that's really, really hard to do. At the same time, once you start doing that as a parent, you're going to see relatives start to, back off a little bit and start to, really listen to you, because you're not fighting with them. Instead, you are, educating them and listening to them as well. So that's really important.
Great. So Dr. Nelson, you get our final question for this conversation. I would imagine that if you're a parent who's raising a child who learns differently and you're dealing with a steady diet of these types of questions and comments, that at some point you're going to experience burnout or at least emotional fatigue. Can you offer us some tips and strategies for parents for self-care and maintaining their emotional well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. I talk with parents every day, and one of the things I tell them to do first and foremost is to just take a minute to reflect on just how much time they're actually spending on themselves, taking care of themselves. I really like that old adage of you can't pour from an empty cup. And I think that saying really helps us permission ourselves to engage in a little bit of self-care, take care of ourselves. I'm not talking about, weekly trips to the day spa, but really just being able to care for our own health and well-being, even if it's just a little bit here and there. Of course, sleep and taking care of your fitness and eating healthy foods, they're really important to do. As everyone knows, those are a little bit, they can be easier said than done. So beyond those, one thing that I like to encourage families to do is find a community. It's that social support concept, right? Some people call it finding your tribe, of people that understand what you're going through. They can validate your feelings, let you know that you're not alone. It's that concept of connectedness, having that connection with other people. Sometimes we can find that through work. We call those employee resource groups, or ERGs, maybe created for families navigating similar issues at home, maybe group therapy sessions, even online forums, and even in your child's school, finding families raising children perhaps that are also neurodivergent can be a really, really great source of connection.
All right, that's going to have to be our final word for this conversation. Dr. Susan Curry, Dr. Gilbert Franco, and Dr. Angela Nelson. Thank you for the knowledge.